Thank you guys all so much for coming. Thanks to John Henry, as David said. He has sponsored our cocktail today with El Buho Mezcal, which I'll be demonstrating in just a sec. And I've been nagging John for about a year, politely of course, because I knew that he knew David, and I had hoped to come and speak to you guys. In many ways, I am here because of you, and I'm not sure if you know that. And part of what I'd like to happen during this Google Talk is to open up a dialogue about not only, you want me over here? Oh, don't forget your cocktail. I'd like this Google Talk to eventually become a dialogue, because I think that not only am I here because of what you guys are doing, but I think that the future of what I do depends on the sort of work that you do. And I'm not sure what brought you here today. I imagine a cocktail might help. Maybe a book would help. I don't know if David mentioned, but we've brought PDT hats, T-shirts. We have El Buho T-shirts, and all of the books that I have on stage on my demo table over there are going to be given out to one of you for asking a question after I stop rambling. So I don't know why you came, but hopefully for whatever reason you're here, you will be rewarded. But what I'd like to do today are a few things. First, I'd like to demo the drink that I made. It's a perfect drink for Cinco de Mayo, which is coming up in just 4 days. So I figured for those of you who came out to maybe learn a thing or two about mixing drinks, I could show you how easy it is to make the drink you're having. And next, I'd like to talk about the book I wrote. Came out in November 2011, the PDT Cocktail book. But I want to take a bit of a sort of different spin. I want to actually talk about the process that I used to come up with this book. A lot of times people, they'll come up to me and ask me, so, you wrote a cocktail book, what was it like? What made you want to write this book? And I think that it's really hard to write something new or to create something new when you don't know what's come before you. So I'd like to talk about the process that I used to develop the PDT Cocktail book. And I'd like to sort of introduce sort of a big idea that I'll throw out in the beginning that I'd like you guys to sort of marinate on as the mezcal sort of like floods into your veins. And maybe we'll talk about it together in about a half an hour. But as I said before, I believe that the internet, Google, YouTube, Wikipedia, on and on and on, has changed the way we learn. It's changed the way we searched. My generation, I'm 36, I'll be 37 this year, was one of the last generations that went to the library when we needed to find something out. The last time I went to the library, I felt like I needed a master's degree to learn how to use it. The internet is a lot easier to use than the library. But one of the things I found as a kid when I used to go to the library before I used the internet to find information was when I looked something up in a card catalog and found out where the shelf was to find it, on my walk to the shelf, I'd oftentimes pass books, all sorts of different books about, ship people tying knots or guns of the early Civil War, or just books that were very interesting to me. And I found that not only in what I'm going to talk about with the PDT Cocktail book, but in how kids and my generation is searching these days, that in many ways what I learned along my searches was just as interesting as what I was going to get. And one of the things that is confounding, ironic, maybe sad, is that when we Google something or when we search for something on the internet, it takes us exactly to what we are looking for usually, and it doesn't allow us to go on that journey along the way and see other things that might interest us. So why don't I get to this drink before I exhaust that topic? In thinking of Cinco de Mayo, the margarita is obviously the cocktail that is most on our mind. In creating a new cocktail, which I guess you could call this a new cocktail, I often take a classic cocktail, the margarita, and play around with it. The margarita, tequila, lime juice, triple sec, Cointreau. I usually use a little agave nectar to sweeten it, to balance it out. So I took that and I played around with it. I'm going to use El Buho Mezcal. I'm going to use fresh squeezed lime juice, a little bit of agave nectar. This is, I usually lengthen it into a syrup so it pours easier. And then a couple twists. And these are things that you probably will see if you go to cocktail bars in New York like Maya Well, which features agave cocktails in the East Village. But you found that your drink from 5-6 years ago has gone from maybe a delicious sour, something like a Sidecar or a Cosmopolitan, something that is strong. It's actually a good drink, sweet and sour. And then people are adding bitters to their cocktails now. And then later, people were adding Saint Germain and creme de violette and floral ingredients. Then people were adding herbs and herbal liqueurs like chartreuse and adding that herbal quality. And then finally, people have started adding spice and hot things. So this is a Hellfire shrub. So taking that original recipe, I'm going to take a shishito pepper, which isn't generally hot. They say that a few of them in each batch is hot. I'm going to add 1/2 ounce of a little bit less because this isn't a syrup. Add that on top of the shishito. I'm going to give that a muddle. And what I did for your cocktail, which is in that giant Canberra over there, was I put all this on top into a large bin and just muddled that just like you're seeing here. I'm going to add 1 ounce of freshly squeezed lime juice. And then I'm going to add 2 ounces of El Buho Mezcal. And you'll notice that when I'm making this cocktail, because I'm speaking, I haven't added any ice. I'm a big proponent when you're making cocktails, especially when you're making cocktails at a bar like mine, where I might be making 3 or 4 cocktails at a time. Build your cocktails without any ice and let them sit. So I could make 4 of these if I wanted. And then as soon as you're ready, then that's when you want to ice your shaker and shake. And John, I don't actually have a glass up here. So this allows me an opportunity for John, my handy barback, to come bring me a glass. I'm going to add my ice on the other side. John Henry, El Buho Mezcal. Thank you very much. Give it up. It takes a village, everybody. It takes a village. So I'm going to get that together. You want to get a nice strong seal there. I always seal the cocktail shaker. You want to seal right here so that it's easy to open. If you put the cocktail shaker straight in, you're going to have a hard time getting it out. Give it a nice hard shake. If you go to a cocktail bar and they're not shaking very hard, order a beer and a Maker's on the Rocks. Strain that. You can fine strain it if you don't want all the little seeds there. And that's it. This is a cocktail. If I were serving it at home, I could put a salt rim on it. I could add some chili to the salt and make it a little colorful. I could add citrus zest. I could add all sorts of stuff and maybe only do salt on the side. You could add a shishito pepper there if you wanted. You could garnish it with a lime wheel. What do you guys think? Refreshing? For some of you, it might be a little too sour. For some of you, it might be a little too strong. For some of you, it might be a little too sweet. One of the things that a lot of people of my credentials maybe don't mention is that's okay. We all have different tastes. So the beauty of I feel like every recipe is modular. So if it's too sweet, pull back a little on the agave. If it's too strong, pull back on the mezcal, and on and on. So that's your cocktail. Does anyone have any left? Man, all right. Because I wanted to make sure that we weren't getting in the way of efficiency here at Google today. And I wanted to get you guys a good buzz before I started on my journey. Now, as I said, part of what I want to talk about is not only the book that I wrote, but the sort of journey that I went on to write it. I first started working at the Pegu Club on Houston Street with Audrey Saunders in 2005. Audrey Saunders was Dale DeGroff's. Dale DeGroff was her mentor. She worked with him right when he was leaving the Rainbow Room, was the head bartender at Dale's bar that was open called Blackbird. When Blackbird closed, Dale brought in Audrey as the head bartender at Bemelman's. Audrey ran Bemelman's for many years and then opened the Pegu Club in 2005. And for me, this was very much a watershed moment in New York cocktail sort of history. I got to be on the opening bar team. At that time, it's hard to imagine because there are dozens and dozens of great cocktail bars, even in Brooklyn, much less Manhattan now. But at that time, the cocktail bars in New York were really Milk and Honey, Flatiron Lounge, Angel Share. I mean, those were the sort of main ones. Basically, there was 3 or 4 bars. Employees Only was Almost Open, and Little Branch was almost open. So there are 5 sort of great cocktail places. Audrey opens the Pegu Club, and it was really sort of a coming out party for the cocktail. In these years, 2005, 2006, 2007, you really see the cocktail bar and the cocktail bartender go from person to person to person to place to place to place till the last couple years where 3 places are begetting 9 places and 9 places are begetting 18 places. So we're seeing an exponential growth. But at the Pegu Club, Audrey, and still to this day, had a collection of vintage cocktail books behind the bar. And at the time, I was interested in cocktail books. I had Dale DeGroff's The Craft of the Cocktail. I had Gary Regan's A Joy of Mixology, which you'll see. I had Ted Hayes' Vintage Spirits and Forgotten Cocktails, which you'll see on my presentation. But I really wasn't aware of how many old books there were out there. And Audrey had original copies of the 1862 Jerry Thomas, of the 1948 Fine Art of Mixing Drinks by David Embury. She had the 1937 Gentleman's Companion by Charles H. Baker, and all these beautiful books for us to look at. And I immediately realized that there's so much about the history of bartending and so much about what I was doing for her there that I really wasn't aware of, and I wanted to investigate more. I went to eBay and started spending all of my tips on old bar books, and started sort of meeting people who had more of these books. I'm going to forward to my first slide. 1862, Jerry Thomas. This is the first bartender's guide. The book on the left, the sort of like old brown one, that is the first edition. The green book on the right is the 1876 edition, and the book in the middle with the torn cover, sorry, these are all my copies. They would have weighed about 70 pounds or I would have brought them, is the 1923 edition with an introduction by Herbert Asbury. This is a book that came out and was printed many times. You can see the price here. I think it says $250. I think it initially started at $125 and then went to $2 and then $250. Each of these books was printed probably in 7 or 8 editions. And in the early days, this bartender's guide was very simple. It was a collection of recipes. The recipes were not like umbrella recipes like cocktails are. They were separated into shrubs, into punches, into scaffas, into negus, into sours. Cocktails were very categorical. And this was a very simple utilitarian book that was obviously meant for bartenders that had, in the 1862 edition, a big appendix that was filled with sort of information for bar owners for how to make your own cordials, how to make your own bitters. This was before spirits were distributed in bottles. So it had information for how to tap kegs of beer and how to blend whiskeys together. Very utilitarian, extremely influential, and it spawned what I'm going to call Jerry's Kids. You can see the 1876 edition of the Bartender's Guide. On your left, you see O.H. Byron's Modern Bartender's Guide and C.F. Lawler's The Mixicologist. Modern Bartender, 1884. The Jerry Thomas in the middle is 1876. The Mixicologist on the right, I believe, is around 1891, 95. There are going to be cocktail geeks on YouTube who are sitting there scolding me for not knowing my dates. So I'm just going to make sure and check my cheat sheet, which I've created here. So yeah, you've got 1894 Byron and 1895 Lawler. And when I call these Jerry's Kids, these are other bartenders from other places. I believe O.H. Byron is New York, and The Mixicologist was published in Cincinnati. But these are books that have very similar gatherings of recipes, some differences. You know, we've gone another 15 years, but the Bartender's Guide really hasn't sort of transformed itself as a genre yet. It's still a collection of recipes with a back appendix that includes information about mixing your own syrups and bitters and cordials. Moving on to about 10 years later, we get the first, what I'm going to call, technical bar manuals. 1900, the book on the bottom, Harry Johnson's Bartender's Manual. And then I believe the first editions of the Hoffman House were published around 1894. This one's around 1912. And you can see the picture of the guy dashing the bitters, and the slide says, you know, this is how you dash a bitter. One of the reasons, why am I showing you these slides? One of the things that I was thinking about when I was writing the PDT cocktail book is, you know, why write a cocktail book unless you're going to add something new? And then what is already out there? What has already been written? And as I started looking through these old books, it was interesting to find how through each generation, you sort of saw an evolution, even in the books themselves. the 1862, the 1890s, things are sort of very formulaic. They hadn't really evolved yet. And then in 1900 to around 1910, you see books like these. These are 300 to 400 page manuals that tell you how to write a guest check, how to hire a porter, how to keep your walk-in clean, how to, the most infinitesimal details were all mentioned in these books. And I thought it was incredibly interesting because we are right now at a time where if I pitched a book to a major New York publisher saying, you know what, I want to write a book and I want to make sure that there's a good 20 pages on how to get the bathrooms cleaned properly, how to make sure the garbage gets collected, how to make sure, how to hire a bartender, how to hire a bar back from Mexico and not get busted by the government. I want to make sure and add that in. The publisher would look at me and be like, this is totally disinteresting, and then just pass it off. If you you look back 110 years, there weren't many, but there were at least a handful of these books that were published and republished and popular, because I can still get my hands on them now for a lot of money, which is showing that during this time, bartending is moving into a craft, is moving into a valued profession. People want to read these books, and the craft of the cocktail is evolving. We move forward from there. This on the left is Kapler, 1895. He bartended at a very posh hotel called the Holland House. Jack's Manual, that's 1907. Dave Wondrich will be disappointed, but I don't remember where Jack worked. And then on the right is 1908, William Boothby. I think I have Kapler. I have Boothby up here to give away, and I have Mr. Johnson up there to give away. These are what I'm calling the first celebrity bar books. And as I said before, we've moved from very sort of simple recipe books to very involved professional guides. To right around 1910, we see these bartenders who have gone from just being guys who ran pubs to being famous. Many of these bartenders at the time had traveled around the country. They had mixed drinks in numerous sort of posh hotels, and by now they have not only their own books, but they have books that they're not calling the Bartender's Manual or How to Mix Drinks, but they're calling it Jack's Manual, or they're calling it, the World's Drinks and How to Mix It, and they're got that weird sort of thing with Boothby where he's the standard authority. But the bartenders kind of are, by 1910, become a celebrity. Moving forward to vest pocket books, which for me remind me of the function that PDAs sort of serve for bartenders now. A lot of times now if you go to a cocktail bar, if the bartender doesn't know the recipe, the first thing everyone does is they grab their phone and they start Googling, well, I can find the recipe, and everyone's sort of like on their phone Googling the recipe. And following, this period of so much, this is the golden age. Drinks from Straub is 1916. The ABCs of Mixing Cocktails, I've actually snuck in. An English book is around 1915. It was republished all the way through the 20s. Drinks and How They're Mixed and Served by Paul Lowe was 1904, but was published for a decade, and Apple Greens is around 1916. So between 1862 and 1916, so many recipes were created, and the guests were so familiar with them that the bartenders needed these little sort of cheat sheet books to put in their vest pockets. So this would be one of the sizes of the books, and they would put them in their vest pocket. And someone came to order a drink and they didn't know where it was, they probably did what most of us do now, is they sort of go over here and they started looking through it. So it's sort of, a medieval form of Google from 100 years ago. And it's interesting. It's also interesting what I saw as I was putting this together for you, and this is why I took these photos, is if you look at the trim sizes of all these books, they're very similar. These are, this is taken from above. They're all very similar size. This one, these are very similar in size, almost the same trim size. Moving forward, now we have this genre of books that are sort of vest pocket books that come out together all around the same 15 years. And then we move to what I'm calling the end of the era. This is a book I've also brought to give away. 1917, Hugo Enslin's Recipes for Mixed Drinks. It's strange. You would think that the sort of last cocktail book to come out before the Golden Age ended and Prohibition was enacted would be like a plush Bible that was filled that came with who knows what, a special box, but it looks like, a very simple book. But this book by Ensslin, who was also a New York bartender, there are at least 50 of his recipes in a book that came out later, which I'm going to be in one of my next slides, the Savoy Cocktail book. And what's interesting about, if you look at Ensslin, 1917, versus some of the books of the late sort of 1800s, is the sophistication of the cocktails by 1917 versus the 1860s. This is a time in America where champagne was around in the early 1800s, but imagine what champagne tasted like after it sat on a horse-drawn cart, crossing the West till it got to the guys, digging for gold. I mean, it probably didn't have much effervescence. Who knows how sweet it was to preserve it. So this is by 1917, especially in New York and in the East Coast, you have all these interesting European ingredients from all over the world, and all of them were going into the cocktails. And the cocktails of this that are in this book and that come from this era are some of the most sophisticated, that have ever been created. But as I said, it's the end of the era. One of the sort of popular myths is that Prohibition was this great time to drink in America. And it wasn't. And when Prohibition was enacted, there was about a year and a half for people who had a lot of money to stock their cellar. And some of them who really did have a lot of money put as much as they possibly could in there. But for most people, they couldn't afford to save up for the end of the world. So, as they ran out of booze, and then pretty soon you're either buying booze from gangsters or you're buying booze from someone who's bringing it in illegally off of a clipper. A lot of these people who were selling the booze were criminals in and of themselves. They could not be trusted. They were adulterating a lot of the spirits, cutting them. You certainly weren't mixing with some of these finer cordials and liqueurs and bitters that you could get when booze was still legal. And drinking was illegal. So you had to do it quietly, you had to do it discreetly. And the great bartenders of the golden age from 1890 to 1916, they either quit bartending or they left. They went to Cuba, they went to Tijuana, they went to Paris, they went to London. They went somewhere else where their skills could be used. They could work in hotels. And what we saw happen during this time, which is interesting, is these sort of Prohibition era guides. Here's how Noble Experiments. There's another one called Giggle Water. And the pub dates for these books are, Here's How's 1927, so that's 1919 to 1933 roughly is Prohibition. So that's towards the end. Noble Experiments is 1930. Giggle Water is 1928. So this is people who, the stash is run dry. There's recipes for how to compound different spirits in there. The recipes have gone from these very sort of sophisticated cocktails from Ensslin to sort of going more towards the Screwdriver or more towards the Bronx. This is a period, and the other thing you'll notice about the trim size, you can't tell by this, but the Here's How books are also, they're really small. And this is a period where books go from being books written by bartenders for bartenders to books written by who knows who, because they don't want to put their name on it because it's Prohibition, for people who are basically hosting these illegal parties, going to speakeasies and wanting to know a little more about it. And the cocktail has really left the cocktail guide has really left the realm of the bartender, has moved into the realm of the sort of amateur or the host. Moving forward from here, as I said before, these great bartenders in New York or in San Francisco or in Chicago, in New Orleans, in Cincinnati who wanted to continue their trade left and they moved on. The Café Royal Cocktail Book, 1937, is from London. The 1930 Savoy Cocktail Book on the right, which is still in print, and the one in the middle, The Artistry of Mixing Drinks by Frank Meyer, around 1937 as well. These are the house cocktail books of three amazing bars. The Café Royal and the Savoy were sort of UKBG, the United Kingdom Bartender Guild. These were sort of their house Bibles in many ways, their sort of Jerry Thomas's. And what happened, thankfully, for the cocktail globally is that a lot of the best drinks like you saw in Ensslin, move right over to Europe. And these are, I have a couple of these. I think I have one of these somewhere to give you guys. But these books are amazing. And this is when you really see the books go from being, Jerry Thomas's Bartender's Guide to being books about the places the drinks came from. Moving forward, post-Prohibition, in my opinion, things kind of start tapering off. They get kind of sad. The Stork Club Cocktail Book, 1946. The Old Waldorf Bar Book, 1935. And Crosby Gage's Cocktail Guide and Ladies' Companion in the middle. I think Crosby Gage might have been gay. But these are books that were written by journalists after Prohibition. And it's interesting, as I said before, we've gone from sort of the bar manual being the, always authored by bartenders to the bar manual kind of, through Prohibition and all these like sort of nifty little gifty guides being something that is now not written by bartenders anymore. They're written by hosts. They're written by sort of like men or women among town. And they're written not for bartenders to make good drinks in bars, but they're written for the hosts to sort of continue their roaring 20s parties into the 30s and 40s. The thing that you will find, and then moving forward, the didactic bartender, 1934, the official mixer's manual by Patrick Gavin Duffy, and 1945-51, Townsend's Bartender's Book. This is when these kind of crotchety bartenders who had sort of been part of the golden age and sort of ridden out through Prohibition, they sort of see what's going on and they're disgusted. And what these books that you'll find from 1934 to 1955 are written, the bartenders are basically, telling the young bartenders, how they used to walk through the snow and sort of how long it took to get to school. And they want them to stop making drinks with orange juice and drinks with cream. They want them to go back to the classics. They want them to learn the classics first, and then they can move forward. But it's almost like the bartender has lost the ability to command an audience anymore. People are not as interested in cocktails as they were before. America does not have the same spirits. We're in the middle of 2 world wars. People are drinking, but they're drinking to get drunk. They're not drinking because the economy and because the country is on the up and up. So I call these the didactic bartender guides. And then we move forward to, I know this is going to end, guys. Hold on. Cocktail Theory. The first cocktail theory book, The Fine Art of Mixing Drinks by David Embury, was not written by a bartender. It was written by a lawyer. It's about 700 pages, incredibly dry and acerbic. David Embury liked his cocktail with a lot of booze, a little bit of sour, and almost no sugar. And this is where we move into the sort of Mad Men era of, sort of hard drinking men in this sort of 7-to-1 martini. Who knows where the bartender is. And I included a book that came out in 2003, The Joy of Mixology, because this is the sort of second theoretical bar book. And then we move, essentially, I'm not sure how many people you've heard talk about the history of the cocktail, but the cocktail really pretty much goes into the toilet by the 1950s. It's highballs, it's old fashions. I think that maybe the Patrick Gavin Duffys of the world sort of got their day, and the drinks they're not very interesting. They're dry, they're strong, they get the ad men through. Once again, we're at war, and pretty much if you want to find anything about cocktails, you've got to look at, sort of books like The Complete Book of Drink by T.E. Carling or these Grossman's guides. And the cocktail book is sort of taken away from the sort of bon vivants and taken away from the sort of gay happy hosts and moved towards the English. And things kind of become very sort of analytical and dry. And then we move forward to the absolute darkest point of the cocktail, the 1970s. There's 2 cocktail books that I'd recommend from the 1970s. One is Stan Jones' Complete Bar Guide from 1977. And I've put another book here from 2010, Difford's Guide, which I do recommend. I recommend both these books. And once again, I want you to look at these books sitting right next to each other because these books are very much those sort of kitchen sink time books that have, thousands of recipes in them. And they both actually have around the same trim size. as we're going through all the possible genres of cocktail books that I could possibly think of writing when I'm thinking, what should I write if I write a cocktail book? The autobiography is actually an option. In the 1950s, Johnny Brooks wrote My 35 Years Behind Bars. He claims that he created the Between the Sheets cocktail, a beguiling mixture of gin and lemon and brandy and Cointreau. Also very dry, something that could certainly get someone who wasn't paying attention to what they're drinking between the sheets. And then a book by my friend Toby Cecchini, Cosmopolitan. Toby wrote this book in 2003, and I consider it to very much be the sort of kitchen confidential of the bartending world. You know, Anthony Bourdain wrote this great book about being a chef that basically involves nothing but parties and drugs and girls and the walk-in, and that's sort of Toby's basically his follow-up to that. I'm sad to inform many of you who are thinking of leaving your excellent job at Google, but that is not the way bartending really is. And then we're getting there, guys. We moved to what I'm calling the modern giants. These are sort of my modern follow-up 100 years later from those celebrity cocktail books. You have Cocktail Technique on your left, written by Katsuo Ueda, the founder of the hard shake method. The hard shake method, for all of you cocktail geeks, you probably know about this, but for those of you who don't, it's a method of shaking using a cobbler shaker that has become very popular among the sort of YouTube set. If you go to a bar and you see someone sort of shaking like this and they look very Japanese, they've probably been watching Katsuo Ueda do this 3-point method shake. Greg Boehm has actually translated this book, and it's excellent. You have The Craft of the Cocktail in the middle. Dale DeGroff, the sort of Yoda and sort of the tree trunk of American cocktails, wrote that in 2002. I have Charles Schumann's American Bar. Ironically, Charles Schumann is from Munich. He has a bar called Schumann's, which has been around for at least 25 years. He's one of the most elegant, charismatic, and interesting bartenders on earth. And his book, American Bar, written by a German, was a huge influence on my book. And then down below that, you have the Cocktails of the Ritz Paris, written by Colin Field, an Englishman who has been bartending at the Ritz in Paris, which is now closed for a couple years, for over 20 years. So we sort of have the modern giants in the cocktail technique. We have a book that is very much one of those Harry Johnson, Hoffman House books that's very technical, very informative as far as what he's thinking when he makes a cocktail. We have the Cocktails of the Ritz Paris, which is sort of a reprise of the House Cocktail book. In American Bar, we have sort of a little bit of everything, which is kind of what I ended up going for. And in Craft of the Cocktail, we have a coffee table book filled with great recipes and photographs. And in my opinion, if you read Craft closely, you'll see a bit of that sort of Patrick Gavin Duffy sort of, let's bring it back, guys. And moving forward, we have this whole genre now of what Dave Wondrich calls mixography. And this is guys, once again, going back to the 1940s, these are guys that know way too much. They have way too many college degrees. And instead of studying whatever you do to get PhDs, they decided to write a cocktail book. So in the 1980s, I believe, Lowell Edmonds wrote Martini. He's a classics professor, I believe, somewhere in a college in New Jersey. In 2004 or 5, forgive me, Dave Wondrich wrote Imbibe. Dave Wondrich also has a PhD in early English literature, I believe, in Comp Lit. William Grimes, Straight Up or on the Rocks, I think he wrote that in 1993. I remember reading that as a college bartender in Madison, Wisconsin. At this time, I was serving cocktails, orange juice from a soda gun, a lot of Alabama Slammers, Long Island iced teas. My idea with molecular mixology was a cement mixer, which is Bailey's with a little bit of Rose's lime, stick a straw in it, snake bites, the whole 9 yards. And I remember reading that book when I was in college and being like, this is so boring. Who would want to drink in a hotel bar? It's actually a pretty good book. 2005 or 6, Ted Hay, a set designer who actually has done the set design for the latest series of Boardwalk Empire. Ted's based out of LA. This book is brilliant, well illustrated. It's called Vintage Spirits and Forgotten Cocktails, and it's really one of the books that is most responsible for the return of a lot of these old sort of weird spirits that go in cocktails that come out of books like this. And on the bottom, the Grog Log, an early 90s book by a sort of tiki guru named Jeff Barry, who has spent the past 20 years trying to find out what people like Trader Vic and Don Beach were putting in these very potent and delicious cocktails that ruled the 40s and the 50s. Last, almost, guys, we're getting there. The Coffee Table book. This is Speakeasy by Jay and Dushan of Employees Only. Certainly, there have been a number of others that I could have put up here. But what I've found in the last 10 years, as I said, thinking about what I'm going to write my cocktail book about, is that the sort of bartender book has sort of, the people buying bartender books from the publishers were used to buying books from chefs. And they were used to not writing professional bar guides. They were used to writing books that were sort of something you could, it had a Manhattan and a martini and a margarita and was sort of light and lively and something that you could put on your coffee table. This is a great book, but it wasn't what I wanted to write. Another book that I've actually edited for the last 7 years is the Food and Wine Cocktail book. When I started working on this book after Rob Willie left, it was just a kind of collection of all sorts of old cocktail books. And what I found in 2005-06 when I started was there was this sort of, as I said before, I started working at the Pegu Club in 2005, and I felt like what was going on all over the country was absolutely unlike anything that had gone on in history before. And I found for the last 7 years that I could use this book with my editor, Kate Crater, and the editors of Food and Wine to actually document what's going on year after year. So our latest edition just came out. The other ones are around, and it's kind of a neat way to follow what is out there. And then last, actually not even last, but not least, is the PDT Cocktail book, a book I wrote in 2011, a book some of you guys probably have in your hands, so maybe you've been pacing through it. What I wanted to do when I wrote this book, and I promise I'm going to open this up for some dialogue in 1 second, is write a book that brought back the 1930s book, brought back illustrations instead of photos. I wanted a book that didn't just have recipes, but had recipes that had a story. I feel like cocktails tell a story, and I wanted the drinks in this book to tell a story. For that reason, the illustrations in the book aren't illustrations of me making cocktails in PDT, but they're illustrations that sort of document maybe the playfulness of the cocktail. I wanted a book that had an annotated bibliography, that had, that not only showed you where I found these recipes, but where you can kind of look for more. I wanted a book that had the food recipes in the back, and on and on. There's one more cocktail book that I want to show you, one more format of cocktail book I want to show you before I start opening things up for conversation. If you guys could play the video. The best bartenders in the world realize that there's a sense of nobility to serving people.
So this is some of the different ice that we use here at Little Branch. We use a hand-cut enormous rock of ice. When you have a drink sitting on that, it will dilute much more slowly, so you can sit there and sip your drink without it turning into a watery mess.
If you have lime juice, or if you have eggs, or if you have cream and it's already a cloudy drink, that's usually the decision maker between whether we stir or shake.
In the fun part, we're going to give it an orange twist, and in this case, a flamed orange twist. You always want to use a nice, fresh orange with a shiny skin.
Sea salt tends to clump around the edge of the glass, whereas kosher salt gives you this nice, fine rim.
This is Irish coffee. You can use the coffee of your choice. 2 brown sugar cubes, you just give them a crush. Irish whiskey is the traditional. A little bit of hot water. You just float it on top. Mint leaf. And that is an Irish coffee.
Caipirinha,
Tom Collins.
daiquiri,
Sazerac.
the mojito,
Gin and tonic.
pisco sour.
This is an app that I did right after I was working on the PDT cocktail book. It came out right before the PDT cocktail book came out, so I couldn't really do much to promote it. But it's a book that is all digital, and it's so hard to explain to someone how to stir a drink. But when you have a video of it, it's completely different. It's a new format of cocktail book. And I guess what I'll leave you with before I take a couple questions, because I know we're running late, is the future of cocktail books, I think, is going to depend heavily on the technology that you guys are working on the way that we search for everything and how we display information. I would argue that it's so much. I prefer, for instance, having something that I can hand someone, something that I can touch, something that I can refer to. And when I wrote this book, I didn't think bartenders would still keep it behind the bar. I figured that everything was moving towards apps, and thankfully that hasn't happened. But I would argue to all of you that there's really never been a better time to drink. The information out there, especially after this seminar, there's, and knowing that, and knowing that there's so much information out there and that this information is being accessed by people all over the world, it's kind of up to you guys for how they'll use it. And I guess the question I have is, as I talked about in the beginning, walking you through the journey that I went on, looking through all these old cocktail books before I weighed in what was good about them or what I didn't like about them and decided what I wanted to write when I wrote my own book. How can the search that we use on a daily basis, many, many times a day, maybe evolve or change so that you can sort of see a little bit of how you find information instead of just getting to that information? So I'll leave that to you guys. No pressure. Do you guys have any questions? Complaints? Thank you. Yep.
Hi. Is it on?
And I had mine kind of like carbonated and draft stuff.
Yep.
But kind of for everything that's come out in like 2013 and into 2012, what do you see as sticking around? What do you see as kind of going to be passe in a year or so?
I think that what's interesting is we live in New York, so what's happening here, will come and go quickly because our sort of the interest cycle here kind of is. One of the things I realized working with the New York media is that really all they write about, God bless them, is what's new and what's hot. So if you want to remain in the media and sort of become popular, you have to constantly evolve. So it's hard to say in the bigger picture how long some of these things will stay around. I think at the end of the day, people buy with their eyes, and they also people are impatient. So the beautiful things, the things that involve a ceremony, the things that create cocktails, that where a guest watches the bartender make the drinks, and then the glass goes to the guest, and then everyone looks at that guest and says, I want that. And then the guest actually likes that drink. Those will be the things that sort of stay around. I think that the reason why people go out for drinks is, instead of making them for themselves in their home, is because they want to sort of see and be seen, even if they want to do it discreetly. So I think that if you apply that logic to some of the trends that are going on, if it's delicious, if it allows you to see and be seen, if it's efficient, I think it'll stay around.
Please use the microphones for your questions, because we are recording.
Yep.
Hi. My question is, I guess I feel like when I was a kid, I couldn't walk into a grocery store and find an avocado. I'd probably had never even seen one. So as the world's become much more global and we have access to all different things from all around the world, how has that sort of changed the kind of drinks that people are, I guess, experimenting with or designing or whatever you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it depends on where you're at. For instance, in San Francisco, the mentality about what ingredients they work with is different than the mentality, say, that we work with it in New York. I mean, New York is so close. We're as close to Europe as we are to San Francisco. So I find that depending on which part of the world you're in, you'll see different sort of trends for how they use ingredients. For instance, in Copenhagen with Noma and the sort of new Nordic cuisine, you'll see a different, more locavore sense, Whereas in New York or in London, you'll probably see more of a sort of like interchangeable global sense where, San Francisco more local and sustainable. But I think that in general, as I said before, it's making drinks, I think, more interesting. And one of the reasons why I've been able to remain as interested as I am in cocktails is because cocktails sort of have an anthropology to them. So, a sort of, you can follow that you have, this is agave based, so I'm going to use an agave based sweetener, and, habanero peppers are sort of things you find in Mexico. And so it's sort of, the more you look at it, I think the more interesting it becomes. I had a reporter recently come to me at a charity event I did a couple nights ago and said, so what are the latest trends in cocktails? What a lot of people around here are saying is that, going back to the basics, more simple cocktails. And one of the secrets I'll tell you about most bartenders is most of them are pretty lazy. So, of course, there is an incentive to keep it simple. But I think that the more you see avocados in cocktails, the more you see these sort of interesting and esoteric cocktails that maybe involve things that you didn't expect or never desired to be in your drinks, it's what makes going out to drink interesting to me.
Thank you.
So first of all, PDT was kind of my first speakeasy.
Yes.
So
we never meant to be a speakeasy, but I'll take that.
Sorry. But going through the phone booth and kind of doing that whole kind of thing was a really awesome introduction. So thank you for that.
No, thank you.
So one thing I want to ask is, so the next time I go, what should I get in terms of cocktail plus deep fried hot dog pairing? And a follow-up, how do I get in?
Yeah, I do have a limited amount of business cards, which we could probably auction off after some of you go to your meetings. But yeah, I think that the way that the menu is set up at PDT is I kind of came from a wine background before I focused on cocktails. So the list goes from sort of light, refreshing, usually white spirit drinks, moving on to sours, moving on to stirred and strong drinks, sometimes rich drinks in the winter. So you can the idea is to drink through it. The idea, what we're trying to do is coarse cocktails. So in an ideal situation, like the ideal PDT experience for me is you start out with something light and dry, something like a Paddington, which is a sort of daiquiri variation with marmalade and absinthe. You move into something that's maybe a touch stronger, a touch sweeter, maybe a touch more bitter, and then you finish off with something stirred, brown and stirred, like the Benton's Old Fashioned, which will send the kids to college. As far as the food, one of the things people always say is, so what hot dog should I have with what cocktail? And really, the food is there. If you have too many of these cocktails, you're going to have to stop having these cocktails. So the food is really there to sort of like sustain you and fortify you as you sip your way through my menu. We have the Chang dog with the kimchi, so as long as you're not on a date, I highly recommend that. The Torres Tots I recommend everyone gets that. That's Sue Torres from Sueños, sort of like all these amazing Mexican ingredients on top. We have the Mission Chinese dog, which has a little bit of Szechuan peppers, so a little numbing as long as that doesn't bother you. And then we have the Wiley dog, which is, as I've said on the menu, that's from WD-50, the dogs go molecular before the drinks. So, they're sort of all there to please you and help you gain weight and kind of keep you drinking. So it's your choice. And
is that what the deep fried mayo is for?
Deep fried mayo is to keep you large, keep you living large. But what I tell my staff is that, ideally we spend so much time keeping this menu up to date that we want to serve you the drinks on this menu. A lot of times cocktail geeks will go to a bar and they'll be like, so what can I get off the menu? And it's just like, what we're trying to do, what we spend all of our time on is this menu. So we do want you to try the drinks on the menu. If none of them sound appetizing, we generally defer to old PDT cocktails or to classics. So that's sort of our procedure. You can walk in just like you do at Milk and Honey and say, I want something brown and stirred. I want something with tequila. I love the Diablo or whatever your favorite drink is. And then they should be able to help you with that too. So I think what we'll do, for those of you that can possibly stay longer or drink more, is I will find we'll reposition one of these tables for those of you who bought a book and want me to sign it still. And you can get a shot of Mezcal as soon as I sign your book. How do you think about that? Sound good? Thank you guys very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jimmy Hand.